My ex tried to ruin my life with lies, harassment, and tried kidnapping them. Now he's lost everything. If you enjoy these crazy stories, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more. And hey, if you didn't like it, go ahead and hit dislike. I won't hold it against you. Let's get into it. I, 38F, have been married to my husband, let's call him Mark, 40M, for 12 years. We have 2 amazing kids, 8 and 6, and on the surface, everything seemed fine. But over the last year, things started to feel off. Mark became distant. He was always working late or out with friends. At first, I brushed it off. I had my own job to focus on, a slightly higher paying one, actually, which meant I was often busy myself. The house we live in, it's under my name because I was the one who qualified for the mortgage. But as the months went on, the late nights became more frequent. He'd come home smelling like cologne I didn't recognize, or he'd be texting someone at odd hours. I had my suspicions, but between work, the kids, and keeping the household running, I didn't have the energy to confront him. Part of me didn't want to believe it. The red flags, though, were impossible to ignore. Mark had always been a laid-back guy, the kind of person who'd leave his phone on the kitchen counter for hours without a second thought. But over the last few months, he'd become oddly protective of it. If I reached for the remote on the coffee table and his phone was nearby, he'd snatch it up like it was a piece of gold. If I tried to pick up the salt shaker at dinner and his phone was sitting face up, he'd quickly flip it over, as if I might accidentally see something I shouldn't. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he was just being cautious because of work emails or something. But then the little things started adding up. He'd take his phone with him everywhere, even to the bathroom. He'd start texting in the middle of conversations and then quickly lock his screen when I glanced over. Once, I jokingly asked, "Who are you texting so much?" "Your secret girlfriend." He laughed it off, but it was a nervous laugh, the kind that made my stomach twist. The final straw came one evening when Mark was in the shower. His phone was on the bed, buzzing incessantly. I wasn't planning to snoop, I really wasn't. But when I walked past and saw the screen light up with a message that read, "Can't wait to see you tomorrow, baby face blowing a kiss," my heart dropped. I picked up the phone, my hands shaking, and saw the name, Tiffany, at the top of the screen. The messages were explicit, to say the least. My stomach churned as I scrolled through weeks of flirty texts, plans to meet up, and even a few photos I wish I could unsee. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. My mind raced as I tried to process what I was seeing. How long had this been going on? Who was Tiffany? And how could Mark do this to me, to our family? But I didn't confront him. Not then. Instead, I stayed calm. I put his phone back exactly where I found it, took a deep breath, and decided to gather evidence. I wasn't going to let him twist this or gaslight me into thinking I was overreacting. I needed proof. Solid, undeniable proof. Over the next 2 months, I documented everything. I started by going through our joint credit card statements. At first glance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But when I looked closer, I noticed random hotel reservations and restaurant charges that didn't add up. A $200 dinner at a fancy steakhouse on a night he claimed to be working late. A $150 charge for a boutique hotel in the next town over. A $300 bill from a jewelry store for a necklace I never received. Mark wasn't spending huge amounts, nothing that would immediately raise red flags, but it wasn't small change either. He was using our joint account to buy Tiffany presents, fund their dates, and cover their little getaways. I took screenshots of every suspicious transaction, noting the dates and amount. I also started paying closer attention to his behavior. He'd leave the house smelling like cologne I didn't recognize and come home with excuses that didn't quite add up. I kept a journal, jotting down every inconsistency, every lie. One evening, he came home with a faint lipstick smudge on his collar, a shade I never wore. Another time, I found a receipt in his jacket pocket for a spa day at a luxury resort. When I asked him about it, He claimed it was a team-building exercise with his coworkers. But when I checked his work calendar, there was no such event scheduled. I also noticed he'd started dressing differently, wearing clothes I hadn't seen before, like a sleek new watch and a pair of designer shoes. When I asked where he got them, he mumbled something about a great sale. But when I checked our bank statements, there were no purchases matching those items. It didn't take a genius to figure out Tiffany was buying him gifts too. The most damning evidence came when I checked his Google Maps timeline. He'd forgotten to turn off location history, and it painted a clear picture of his lies. On nights he claimed to be working late, he was at restaurants or hotels across town. One weekend, when he said he was visiting his parents, the timeline showed him at a romantic bed and breakfast 2 hours away. Once I had gathered enough evidence of Mark's infidelity and his misuse of our joint finances, I knew I had to protect myself and my children. My parents had always been financially savvy, and they'd set up a trust fund for me years ago, ensuring I'd be taken care of for life. The trust was something I'd kept completely separate from Mark, partly because my parents insisted on it, and partly because I'd always believed in having a safety net. The trust wasn't just a lump sum of money, it was a carefully managed portfolio of investments, properties, and other assets. My parents had always been cautious, especially when it came to Mark. They'd never fully trusted him, and neither had my brother, Jake, who's a lawyer. Jake had always been my protector, and when I told him about Mark's affair and the financial red flags I'd uncovered, he immediately sprang into action. "You need to secure everything," Jake said during one of our late-night calls. "The house, your savings, your investments, everything. If Mark finds out about the trust or tries to go after your assets, it could get messy." I knew he was right. Mark had already been dipping into our joint accounts to fund his affair, and I wasn't about to let him touch the assets I'd worked so hard to build. With Jake's help, I began the process of transferring everything into my dad's name. It wasn't something I did lightly, but it was the safest way to ensure Mark couldn't lay claim to anything. The house was the first thing we tackled. Since it was already in my name, Jake helped me draft the paperwork to transfer ownership to my dad. We framed it as a temporary measure, a way to protect the kids' home in case things got ugly during the divorce. My dad didn't hesitate to help. "This is your future," he said. "We're not letting that man take a single thing from you." Next came my savings and investment. Over the years, I'd been quietly building my own nest egg, separate from Mark. I'd always been careful to keep my finances independent, and now I was grateful for that foresight. Jake helped me move everything into accounts under my dad's name, ensuring Mark wouldn't have access to a single penny. The trust was a bit more complicated, but Jake handled it like a pro. Since the trust was already in my name and managed by a third-party trustee, Mark had no legal claim to it. Still, Jake advised me to keep it under wraps until the divorce was finalized. "The less he knows, the better," he said. As the weeks went by, I continued to document Mark's infidelity and financial misstep. I kept a detailed journal of every suspicious charge, every lie, every inconsistency. Jake assured me that the evidence would be crucial during the divorce proceedings. The night I finally confronted Mark, I was calm, unnervingly so. Jake had advised me to record the conversation, and I had my phone tucked discreetly into my pocket, the voice memo app running. Mark came home late, as usual, reeking of that unfamiliar cologne and looking like he'd just walked out of a rom-com montage. He was all smiles, pretending everything was normal, but I could see the guilt flickering in his eyes. I didn't say much at first. I just sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea, and waited for him to speak. He tried to make small talk, asking about the kids and how my day had been. I gave him short, neutral answers, never letting on that I knew anything. Finally, he noticed the tension. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone defensive. I looked at him, my expression blank. "You tell me, Mark." He froze for a moment, then forced a laugh. "What are you talking about? You're acting weird." "Am I?" I said, leaning back in my chair. Or are you just feeling guilty about something? His face went pale, but he quickly recovered. Guilty? About what? You're being paranoid. I didn't react. I just kept staring at him, waiting. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Look, he said, running a hand through his hair. If this is about me working late, I've told you a million times, it's just a busy season at work. Is that what you call it? I asked, my voice steady. A busy season? He shifted uncomfortably. What's that supposed to mean? I didn't answer. Instead, I pulled out my phone and opened the credit card statements I'd printed earlier. I slid them across the table toward him. He glanced at them, his face tightening. What's this? You tell me, I said. $200 dinners, hotel stays, jewelry purchases. All on nights you were supposedly working late. He opened his mouth to protest, but I cut him off. And then there's Tiffany. The name hung in the air like a bomb. Mark's face went slack, and for a moment, he just stared at me, speechless. Who's Tiffany, Mark? I asked, my tone icy. He tried to laugh it off. I don't know what you're talking about. You're being crazy. Am I? I said, pulling out my phone and showing him a screenshot of one of their text exchanges. His face crumpled. Okay, fine, he snapped. There's someone else. Happy now? How long? I asked, my voice cold. He hesitated, then sighed. 6 months. 6 months, I repeated, letting the words sink in. And you thought I wouldn't notice? He didn't answer. He just sat there, looking like a cornered animal. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. The recording on my phone captured everything. His confession, his lies, his guilt. Jake had been right. Mark had dug his own grave. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm. Get out. He stared at me, stunned. What? You heard me, I said. Get out of my house. He opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off. Now. He left that night, and I didn't look back. The recording, along with all the other evidence I'd gathered, would ensure he got exactly what he deserved. After Mark left that night, he didn't waste any time moving in with Tiffany. It was almost comical how quickly he set up shop in her apartment, as if he'd been waiting for an excuse to start his new life. I didn't bother trying to stop him. In fact, I was relieved to have him out of the house. The kids, though, were heartbroken. They didn't understand why Daddy wasn't coming home anymore, and no matter how much I tried to explain it in a way that wouldn't hurt them, they still cried themselves to sleep some night. Mark, for his part, didn't seem to care much about the kids' feelings. During the divorce proceedings, he made it clear that he didn't want custody. I'm not cut out for full-time parenting, he said during one of our mediation sessions, as if he were talking about a job he'd quit rather than his own children. It was a gut punch, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I focused on protecting what was mine. What Mark did care about, however, was money. Once the divorce was underway, he went after every asset he could think of. He demanded half of the house, even though it was in my name and had been transferred to my dad's ownership before he could lay claim to it. He tried to go after my savings, my investments, and even my parents' assets, claiming that they owed him for the years he'd spent as part of the family. It was absurd, but Tiffany was clearly pulling the strings in the background. She had expensive tastes, designer clothes, luxury vacations, fancy dinners, and it was obvious she saw Mark as her ticket to a lavish lifestyle. She was the one pushing him to go after everything, whispering in his ear about how he deserved more. Jake, my brother and lawyer, was my saving grace throughout all of this. He made sure Mark's demands went nowhere. The house? Already in my dad's name, and Mark had no legal claim to it. My savings and investments? Transferred to my dad's accounts before the divorce proceedings even began. The trust fund my parents had set up for me? Ironclad and completely out of Mark's reach. Mark didn't take it well. During one particularly heated mediation session, he slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "This isn't fair. You're hiding everything." I stayed calm, leaning back in my chair and folding my arms. "I'm not hiding anything, Mark. I'm protecting what's mine. You're the one who walked out, remember?" He glared at me, but he didn't have a response. The truth was, Mark had come into the marriage with very little, a modest savings account, a beat-up car, and not much else. Over the years, I'd been the one building our financial security, and now he was realizing just how little he was entitled to. Tiffany, meanwhile, was growing increasingly frustrated. She'd been counting on a big payout, and when it became clear that wasn't going to happen, she started pressuring Mark even more. I heard through mutual friends that they were fighting constantly, with Tiffany accusing Mark of lying to her about his financial situation. In the end, Mark walked away with almost nothing. He got a small portion of our joint savings, enough to cover his legal fees and not much else, and that was it. The house, my investments, the trust fund, all of it was safe. The kids were still struggling with the divorce, but I did my best to reassure them. "Daddy loves you," I told them, even though I wasn't sure it was true anymore. "He's just going through a tough time right now." Mark, for his part, made no effort to repair his relationship with the kids. He showed up for his scheduled visits, but he was distant and distracted, always checking his phone or rushing off to some important meeting. It broke my heart to see the kids' disappointment, but I knew they were better off without him. After the divorce was finalized, Mark and Tiffany's relationship quickly began to unravel. It wasn't the picture-perfect romance they'd imagined. Tiffany, with her expensive tastes and high expectations, was growing increasingly frustrated with Mark's inability to keep up with her lifestyle. She wanted designer clothes, luxury vacations, and fancy dinners, all the things Mark had promised her during their affair. But without access to my assets or the financial stability he'd had during our marriage, Mark was struggling to deliver. Their fights became more frequent and more intense. Tiffany would accuse Mark of lying to her about his financial situation, while Mark would snap back, blaming her for pressuring him into the divorce in the first place. They were trapped in a toxic cycle, each resenting the other but too stubborn to walk away. Meanwhile, their professional lives were about to take a nosedive. Someone, an anonymous source, sent a detailed complaint to their workplace, exposing their affair and pointing out that their relationship violated company policy. Neither Mark nor Tiffany had been discreet during their affair, and it didn't take long for HR to launch an investigation. When the news broke, it was chaos. Mark and Tiffany were called into separate meetings with HR, where they were confronted with the evidence of their relationship. Despite their attempts to downplay it, the company had a strict policy against workplace romances, especially between a manager and a subordinate. Within weeks, both Mark and Tiffany were let go. Losing their jobs was a devastating blow, especially for Mark. He'd always taken pride in his career, and now he was unemployed, with no savings to fall back on. Tiffany, who had been living paycheck to paycheck even before the affair, was equally desperate. Mark tried to find another job, but the circumstances of his dismissal made it difficult. Potential employers would call his previous workplace for a reference, only to be told that he'd been terminated for violating company policy. Tiffany, meanwhile, struggled to find work in her field, as her reputation had taken a hit as well. Financially, Mark was drowning. He'd spent what little money he had from the divorce settlement trying to impress Tiffany, buying her expensive gifts, taking her on weekend getaways, and dining at upscale restaurants. But now, with no income and mounting bills, he was barely scraping by. Tiffany's expensive tastes didn't help. She continued to pressure Mark to keep up with her lifestyle, even though he could no longer afford it. She'd send him links to designer handbags or suggest they go on a tropical vacation, oblivious to the fact that Mark was barely keeping the lights on. Their fights escalated, with Tiffany accusing Mark of being a failure and Mark lashing out at her for being selfish and materialistic. They were miserable together, but neither of them was willing to admit defeat. Mark was too proud to walk away, and Tiffany was too invested in the idea of a glamorous life to let go. Meanwhile, I was thriving. With my assets secure and my career on track, I was able to provide a stable, loving home for the kid. They were still adjusting to the divorce, but they were doing better than I'd expected. They missed Mark, but they were starting to understand that his absence wasn't their fault. Update 1. It's been 6 months since the divorce was finalized, and life has been good. Surprisingly good. The kids are thriving, my career is on track, and I've even started seeing someone new. Let's call him Daniel. He's kind, grounded, and everything Mark wasn't. We're taking things slow. I'm not rushing into anything, especially not with the kids still adjusting to the changes in our lives. Mark doesn't know about Daniel, and I plan to keep it that way for as long as possible. Meanwhile, Mark's life has continued to spiral. His relationship with Tiffany finally fell apart a few months ago. From what I've heard through mutual friends, their fights became unbearable, and Tiffany eventually walked out, leaving Mark to deal with the mess they'd made. She'd grown tired of his empty promises and financial struggles, and she moved on to someone who could afford her expensive tastes. Mark, now alone and desperate, tried to come crawling back to me. It started with a text, just a casual, "Hey, how are you?" as if we were old friends catching up. I ignored it. Then came the calls, which I also ignored. But Mark wasn't one to give up easily. One evening, he showed up at the house unannounced. I opened the door to find him standing there, looking disheveled and desperate. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice shaky. I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe. "About what, Mark?" He hesitated, then launched into a rambling apology. "I made a mistake, okay? A huge mistake. Tiffany she was a distraction, and I lost sight of what really matters. You and the kids, you're my family. I want to make things right." I stared at him, unimpressed. "You had 12 years to make things right, Mark. You don't get to waltz back in now that your life's fallen apart." He looked genuinely hurt, but I didn't care. This wasn't about me or the kids. This was about him. He was broke, alone, and desperate for someone to bail him out. When I didn't budge, Mark switched tactics. "Look, I'm not asking for much. Just a little help to get back on my feet. I'm struggling here, and I know you've got the means to help me out." I laughed. I couldn't help it. "You've got to be kidding me. You think I'm going to give you money after everything you've done?" He opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off. "Get off my porch, Mark, and don't come back." He left, but that wasn't the end of it. Mark's family, his parents and siblings, started reaching out to me, trying to manipulate me into taking him back. It started with a few texts here and there, but soon it became a full-blown campaign. "He's changed." His mom texted me one day. "He's realized what he lost, and he's willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." I didn't respond. Then came the calls, endless, relentless calls. His sister left voicemails begging me to think of the kids and give him another chance. His dad even showed up at my house one afternoon, trying to guilt-trip me into reconciling with Mark. "He's your husband," his dad said, as if that still meant something. "You can't just throw away 12 years of marriage." I stood my ground. Mark threw it away, not me. And I'm not going to let him, or any of you, manipulate me into taking him back. It was exhausting, but I refused to give in. I blocked their numbers, changed my email address, and made it clear that I wasn't interested in hearing from them. Mark, meanwhile, continued to spiral. Without Tiffany or me to fall back on, he was struggling to make ends meet. He'd taken a low-paying job just to cover his basic expenses, but it wasn't enough to dig him out of the hole he'd created. The kids still see him during his scheduled visits, but even they've started to notice how different he is. "Daddy seems sad," my youngest said one day after a visit. I hugged her tight. "Daddy's going through a tough time, but that's not your fault, okay? He loves you, and so do I. As for me, I'm moving on. Daniel has been a breath of fresh air, someone who respects me and values what I bring to the table. We're taking things slow, but it's nice to have someone in my life who actually cares about me and the kids. Update 2. Mark's desperation had reached a new level. Despite my repeated attempts to shut him down, he'd become relentless in his efforts to contact me. It started with texts and calls, but when I blocked his number, he resorted to showing up at my house unannounced. At first, it was just him standing on the porch, begging to talk. But as time went on, his visits became more frequent and more aggressive. One evening, things came to a head. I was at home with the kids, and Daniel had come over for dinner. We were in the kitchen, laughing and chatting while the kids played in the living room. It was a rare moment of peace, and I was grateful for it. Then came the knock on the door. I opened it to find Mark standing there, looking disheveled and agitated. His eyes immediately darted past me, landing on Daniel, who was standing in the kitchen. Mark's face turned red, and before I could say a word, he exploded. "Who the hell is this?" he shouted, pointing at Daniel. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me to shield the kids from what was about to happen. "Mark, you need to leave," I said firmly. But he wasn't listening. "Is this why you won't take me back? You've already moved on? What, was I not good enough for you?" I tried to stay calm, but Mark was spiraling. He started cursing at me, calling me names and accusing me of betraying him. His voice was loud enough that the kids could hear him through the door, and soon enough, they were peeking out the window, their faces filled with confusion and fear. Daniel stepped outside, trying to defuse the situation. "Hey man, let's calm down. This isn't the time or place." But Mark wasn't having it. He turned on Daniel, shouting and threatening him until Daniel finally backed off, not wanting to escalate things further. "Mark, you need to leave," I said again, my voice shaking with anger. "You're scaring the kids." That seemed to snap him out of it, at least a little. He glanced at the window, where the kids were still watching, and his expression softened for a moment. But then he turned back to me, his eyes filled with rage. "This isn't over," he spat before storming off. I went back inside, my heart pounding. The kids were full of questions. "Why was Daddy yelling?" my youngest asked, her voice trembling. I knelt down and pulled her into a hug. "Daddy's just having a hard time right now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But it's not your fault, okay? Mommy and Daddy both love you very much." It was a tough conversation, and it broke my heart to see them so confused and upset. But I knew I had to protect them, from Mark's outbursts and from the chaos he was trying to bring back into our lives. The next day, I called my brother, Jake. He'd been my rock throughout the divorce, and I knew he'd know what to do. "Mark's losing it," I told him. He showed up at the house last night, freaked out when he saw Daniel, and started cursing at me in front of the kids. "I'm worried he's going to do something stupid." Jake listened carefully, then sighed. "I was afraid it might come to this. Mark's desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. We need to be prepared." A few days later, my fears were confirmed. Mark filed a motion to reopen the custody agreement, claiming that I was an unfit mother and that he deserved majority custody of the kids. He also filed for spousal support, arguing that he was struggling financially and that I had the means to help him. It was a blatant attempt to manipulate the system, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it. Jake and I went to work, gathering evidence to counter Mark's claims. We had documentation of his erratic behavior, his financial irresponsibility, and his lack of involvement in the kids' lives. We also had testimony from the kids' teachers and therapists, who could attest to how well they were doing under my care. The court date was set, and I was nervous but determined. Mark's lawyer tried to paint me as cold and unfeeling, but Jake was quick to shut them down. He presented the evidence we'd gathered, highlighting Mark's instability and his inability to provide a stable home for the kid. When it was Mark's turn to speak, he tried to play the victim. "I just want to be a part of my kids' lives," he said, his voice cracking. "I made mistakes, but I'm trying to do better." But the judge wasn't buying it. "Mr. Last Name," she said, "your actions speak louder than your words. You've shown a pattern of irresponsible behavior, and I can't in good conscience grant you majority custody." In the end, the judge denied Mark's motion for custody and spousal support. She did, however, order him to attend parenting classes and counseling if he wanted to maintain his visitation right. It was a victory, but it didn't feel like one. The whole ordeal had reopened old wounds, and I was exhausted. The kids were struggling, too, and I knew it would take time for them to process everything. As for Mark, he didn't take the ruling well. He stormed out of the courtroom, muttering curses under his breath. I haven't heard from him since, but I know this isn't the end. Mark's not the type to give up easily, and I'm sure he'll try something else eventually. Update 3. If I thought Mark's previous antics were the peak of his desperation, I was sorely mistaken. After losing in court, Mark decided to take his fight to social media, and it was every bit as messy and exhausting as you'd expect. It started with a post on Facebook. Mark wrote a long, emotional rant about how he was being kept away from his children and how I was poisoning them against him. He painted himself as the victim, claiming that I was denying him access to the kids and making unilateral decisions about their lives. He even went so far as to accuse me of using my financial power to manipulate the court system. The post was filled with half-truths and outright lies, but that didn't stop people from engaging with it. Within hours, it had dozens of comments, some from his family and friends who were quick to rally behind him, and others from strangers who didn't know the full story but were eager to weigh in. "Stay strong, Mark," one comment read. "No one should be kept from their kids." "This is so sad," another person wrote. "Children need their father." I was furious when I saw the post. Not only was Mark spreading lies, but he was also dragging our kids into a public spectacle. I didn't want them to see any of this, but I knew it was only a matter of time before someone showed it to them or they stumbled across it themselves. I called Jake immediately. "Mark's gone nuclear," I said, my voice shaking. "He's posting lies about me on Facebook and people are eating it up." Jake sighed. "I was afraid he might try something like this. Let me handle it." True to his word, Jake went to work. He sent Mark a cease and desist letter, demanding that he take down the post and stop spreading false information about me. But Mark, of course, didn't listen. Instead, he doubled down, posting even more inflammatory content and encouraging his followers to share it. It wasn't just Mark either. His family had joined the fray, posting their own rants and encouraging others to stand up for what's right. They were relentless, flooding my social media accounts with messages and comments, some of which were downright threatening. "You're a terrible mother," one message read. "Let Mark see his kids." "You're going to regret this," another person wrote. "Karma's coming for you." The harassment didn't stop online. Mark and his family started showing up at my house again, sometimes late at night, pounding on the door and demanding to see the kids. They'd leave voicemails and texts, accusing me of being selfish and cruel. It all came to a head one evening when Mark showed up at my house while Daniel was over. He was drunk and belligerent, shouting and cursing at me through the door. The kids were in their rooms, but they could hear everything, and I could see the fear in their eyes as they peeked out from the hallway. "You think you can keep me away from my kids?" Mark screamed. "You're nothing without me." Daniel tried to intervene, but Mark turned on him, shouting and threatening him until Daniel finally called the police. When they arrived, Mark was still yelling, but he sobered up quickly when he realized he was about to be arrested. The officers took him away, but the damage was done. The kids were shaken, and I was at my wits' end. I knew I couldn't let this continue. The next day, I went to the courthouse and filed for a restraining order against Mark and his family. Jake helped me draft the paperwork, and we included evidence of the harassment, screenshots of the social media posts, recordings of the voicemails, and statements from the police officers who'd responded to the incident at my house. The judge granted the restraining order, barring Mark and his family from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of my home, workplace, or the kids' school. It was a relief, but I knew it wouldn't stop Mark completely. He'd already proven that he was willing to break the rules to get what he wanted. Sure enough, Mark didn't take the restraining order well. He went back to social media, posting even more inflammatory content and accusing me of abusing the legal system to keep him away from his kids. His family followed suit, sharing his posts and encouraging others to do the same. The harassment didn't stop entirely, but it did slow down. Mark and his family knew that if they violated the restraining order, they could face serious consequences, and that seemed to be enough to keep them at bay for now. Meanwhile, I was doing everything I could to shield the kids from the chaos. I sat them down and explained that Daddy was having a hard time, but that it wasn't their fault. I reassured them that they were loved and safe, and that I would always protect them. It wasn't easy, but I knew I had to stay strong for them. Daniel was a huge help, offering support and encouragement whenever I needed it. Jake, as always, was my rock, helping me navigate the legal system and standing by my side every step of the way. As for Mark, I don't know what the future holds. He's clearly not done fighting, and I'm sure he'll try something else eventually. But for now, I'm focusing on my kids and rebuilding our lives. If you thought that was crazy, hit that like button and subscribe for more wild stories. And if you didn't quite enjoy it, feel free to hit the dislike. Your feedback means a lot. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think, or share your own experiences. And don't forget to check out my other videos for more insane tales. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.